What if the Atlantic slave trade never happened? The Atlantic slave trade. Millions of human beings suffered through this journey, treated as little more than property. Of course, the Atlantic slave trade was not the first time that humans enslaved other humans. Slavery is older than even written history, although it has boomed after the agricultural revolution around 12,000 years ago. The Atlantic slave trade stands out for the sheer number of people involved in it. In the 15th to the 19th century, about 12.5 million slaves were shipped to the New World. Africa has had a history of slavery, even continuing to this present day. The Arab slave trade, combined with the Atlantic slave trade, did a number on the continent. The African continent was essentially bled dry of vast amounts of its human population, which is kind of bad. So, why did Europeans participate in the slave trade? Well, they were starting to develop colonies in the New World and needed cheap labor to work the lands they found. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations required a lot of work, and since the Europeans had kind of basically exterminated the Native Americans, it was not an option to use the natives as slave labor. Paid labor would have been too expensive to use, so Europeans turned to African slaves to provide free labor. The central cause of the slave trade is need for labor. So, if the slave trade were not to have happened, this labor would go unsatisfied. This is why I see this scenario as very unlikely. If Europeans were on the search for free labor, they would probably turn to Africa. If they didn't trade in slaves, then the growth of their colonies would be severely impaired. If Europeans for some reason did not enslave Africans, then they would be left with a couple of options. They would be forced to use indentured servants to fill that labor, or they would have to give up any hopes of building large scale plantations. Since indentured servants would only provide labor for a short amount of time, once their contract was up, they were free to do as they pleased. This means that paid labor would be the only long term option for plantation owners, rendering everything else, such as the crops produced, very expensive. This means that tobacco, sugar, and cotton would remain a highly luxurious commodity that would largely be refined to the upper classes. Now let's look at how the European colonies would progress without slavery. Without the abundant, cheap labor provided by slaves, agriculture would be a smaller part of the colonies. This means that none of the plantations that we see in our timeline develop. Instead, the colonies would be more akin to the New England colonies of the 13 British colonies. The economy would be based on commerce and trade. However, even this will be severely restricted by the absence of slave labor. Needless to say, all of the European colonies in the New World would be set back by the loss of slaves. Slavery really allowed for the growth of the colonies, economically and through an influx of population. Without that source of labor, the whole system would be thrown out of whack. The colonies would have much smaller populations. First of all, blacks made up a large portion of the population in all of the colonies, especially the ones in Caribbean and South America. If you were to look at any map of the Atlantic slave trade, it would be obvious that the vast majority were sent to South America and the West Indies. Since there wouldn't be a slave trade in this scenario, the population of these regions would be severely diminished, in the millions. The only inhabitants of the region would be the remaining Native Americans, perhaps a few indentured servants and settlers from their home countries. You might say, well, Indians from India were used as indentured servants and cheap labor in our timeline by the British. So that might be the case in this timeline as well? Yes, they would likely fill some of that vacuum, but not all. However, wouldn't still be true slavery, and the labor would still have to be paid for. Also, when their contracts were to run out, the indentured servants could simply leave and do as they wished. Thus, without a true source of free labor, the industries that sprang up in the New World in our timeline simply would not exist. So, with that in mind, how would the New World look like? Well, the British, along with the rest of the European powers, would hold on to their colonies, since there never would be a large population to gather resistance, rebel against their mother countries. The British would never expand past the Appalachian Mountains, not wanting to risk a war with the Native Americans. This is especially considering the tiny population of colonists in the New World relative to our timeline. The European powers may still be able to dominate the rest of the world through advances in technology and fierce competition with one another, but I don't think they will be as rich or powerful as they were in our timeline. Slave labor can be argued to be the main factor that essentially built up all of the industries and colonies of the European nations. Without that cheap labor, most of the lands in the New World would lay unused or in the hands of Native Americans. Speaking of Native peoples, they would wield much more power in this timeline. Faced with only a small number of colonists, the natives would essentially dominate the colonies and would exercise much more influence. But back in Africa, you would see the biggest change. The Atlantic slave trade basically destroyed any chance of Africa becoming a powerful continent. While Asia and Europe were growing by millions of people, Africa was losing millions of people. This means that generations of the continent's youngest and brightest were being shipped to a distant continent, and this human toll was really massive. Also, to add to this conflict, a bunch of local African rulers fought one another to enslave more blacks. Without any of this conflict and mass depopulation, I see Africa as much more advanced than in our timeline. And if Europeans were to try to colonize the continent in the 1800s, I think they would face much more resistance and violence than they did in our timeline. I'm not saying that Africans will be immune to colonization, but they will be much more powerful in this timeline. Organized kingdoms and states would flourish before the arrival of the Europeans, would be able to put up much more of a fight. For example, look at Africa today. It's rapidly growing in population, but if the slave trade had not occurred, it would already be very populous. So let's look at the world today. Africa today is much more populous than it already is, and is somewhat more stable. Europe is not as powerful, although it still does have large holdings in the Americas. In the Americas, we can see that the population is much smaller than in our timeline. It is made up mostly of Europeans, colonists, indentured servants from India, and Native Americans. Blacks are a very small minority in this place. There are no countries in the New World, only colonies and vast swaths of land owned by native people. Without enough population to mount a rebellion against the mother nations, or an incentive to do so, no independent countries exist in the Americas. Well, there you have it, folks. A world without the Atlantic slave trade. Like and subscribe for more great content, and thanks for watching.